This is a big question.
I think Black Studies is important because I think Black history, or specifically Black British history, which is British history, isn't really taught in schools. I didn't know about the Windrush until like my 20s probably, and that was still quite vague. You know, I didn't really know about colonisation. I didn't know about why even just why my parents have very English sounding names, and most of my aunties and uncles, but they come from, you know, a country that, you know, that isn't traditionally, I suppose, English speaking. I think pre-colonialism.
The Black Studies is important because we are analysing the history and the contradictions of those disciplines, inherent in those disciplines.
Black Studies are, you know, really, really important, I think, just in terms of, you know, not only for people of colour, but for the wider society. I think Black Studies are really, really important, and Black history.
Black Studies is a cross-disciplinary area because it's important for two reasons. The first one is, if you look at the history of most disciplines, whether it's philosophy, art, sociology, the disciplines have evolved with a white bias, in the sense that the black subject has historically been considered inferior, and it's been considered inferior because of the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of empire. It's very difficult to argue that it's an enlightened subject and at the same time subject black people to a brutal regime.
Black Studies is absolutely imperative, and especially now post George Floyd's murder, because what we've seen is that there is this dominant narrative, and this dominant narrative excludes marginalized groups that, like I'm from, and it represents this image of the world, of the society, and you can bring it back down to of the city that I'm living in, that there are only certain people who contribute to the world, to industry, to economy, to literature, to whatever field you want to think about.
It's about rewriting the narratives that have been written about black people, but from their own perspective, and understanding their own lived experience. It's like you walk in someone's shoes, that's where you can understand how the person feels.
I would have grown up having been proud of my heritage and having had a better understanding of my heritage. Had Black Studies or Black British history been taught at school, I think that would have also helped a lot of my peers growing up. You know, at school I experienced racism and bullying at some point for my heritage. And I think that just shows that there needs to be that level of understanding and education for all pupils, all students of all backgrounds as well. I understand you can't cover every single inch of like Black Studies or Black history, but I think it's really important. But there are a lot of key moments in history that do need to be explored.
Black Studies is also linked to what we call critical race theory, which basically is looking at social justice, you know, for black people in terms of how they've been treated, you know, in the past, and the issues we face in terms of institutional racism and systemic racism that is occurring. And so with Black Studies, basically, it doesn't mean that doing Black Studies means that you are racist, but doing Black Studies simply means that you are fighting against race as a social construct, which basically is looking at equity and equality and justice, social justice for every human being.
The second reason is there's a series of practices from black activism, which I think is important to cross disciplines, which involves listening, which involves critical analysis, and which involves rethinking existing hegemony. And I think Black Studies is important, but it's important to realise that Black Studies isn't necessarily about what we would consider black people in terms of people from the African diaspora. Black studies is a critical analysis of people from the South, and it's an engagement of issues from the South within the Western Academy.
We're part of society, so I think for too long, black studies or the study of black culture is, you know, that narrative is just been marginalised quite a lot, and I think it's really important. It's we are part of British culture, so I think it shouldn't be a kind of, you know, it should be a mainstream subject, black studies.
It's important because then those people with a marginalised view can be made aware of the fact that actually it takes all sorts to make this world go around.
There will be a point at some point this week where I'll go, oh.
Good gracious me. This chair is too low. Thank you. Right.